Chapter 13. Flight. Grabbing a suitcase, Tom dove into the bushes, trying to put as much of the thick undergrowth between himself and his pursuer as he could. Scout had been poised at the opening as he emerged, but Tom paid no attention to his dog, trusting him to follow him on his own. In his fear, he paid no attention to which way he was running. He crashed through the tangled underbrush, fleeing from the danger behind him. Luckily, he now had clothes to protect him, so he didn't have to worry about being skinned alive by the sharp branches. He had gone about 20 meters when he heard a piercing scream of pain and wrath behind him. It was the poacher, screaming curses at Scout. Apparently, the dog had attacked him. Startled, Tom stopped. Should he go back? If the poacher was unarmed, Scout could handle him without any help. But Tom had seen a rifle in the shack, and he was sure the man would be carrying a knife. Besides, he thought he had heard more than one voice on the first time. Perhaps Jimmy and his cronies were with him. He listened closely. The screaming and cursing had stopped. All he heard was muffled conversation, but he couldn't understand what was being said. The wind had risen and the leaves were rustling. Tom got the impression that the poacher had retreated inside the thorn barrier to protect himself against the dog. Had he gone back to fetch his rifle? "Here, Scout," he called quietly but insistently. He repeated it once more, afraid the dog wouldn't be able to find him in the dense woods. Long seconds dragged by, but finally the branches parted, and Scout stood beside him. The dog wagged his tail happily. Relieved, Tom threw his arm about the dog's neck. Once more he picked up the suitcase, and with renewed hope and strength, he began forcing his way through the bushes. He was sorry that he hadn't paid closer attention to where he was going. Now he had no idea how to reach the path that he had followed to get here. He wasn't even sure in which direction the lake was. But his first concern was to get as far from the shack as he could. If only these woods weren't so horribly dense. His pursuers probably knew the woods very well. He plunged on through the stubborn undergrowth, the suitcase growing heavier and heavier. It was cumbersome and slowed him down. Suddenly he heard a sharp, piercing whistle, and a second later he heard two more from different directions. Tom stopped in fright. The first whistle had come from behind him, close to the hut, but the other two had come from ahead of him, one to the left and one to the right. The poacher and his gang were signaling each other. He was surrounded. Desperately, he looked about him, panting with fear. He tried to think of a plan, but his mind was in a whirl. Again, Scout came to his rescue. He looked up at Tom as if to say, "Follow me," and then slipped between the leaves in another direction. Tom, who had been saved more than once by relying on the dog's senses, willingly followed his friend. He marveled at the way Scout took advantage of all kinds of breaks in the dense underbrush, slipping through without any trouble. It wasn't as easy for Tom, however, and the dog repeatedly had to wait for him. Nevertheless, they were moving quite fast. The whistle sounded again, not far behind them. Tom stopped and waited a couple of seconds. Then he heard the second whistle, also very close and straight to the right. Immediately, the third sounded some distance ahead and to the left. Tom's heart was pounding. The whistle to the right had been terrifyingly close, but now at least he knew exactly where his pursuers were. If he kept on in the same direction, he had a chance of slipping between them. He and Scout would have to move very fast. But as he began to hurry on, to his puzzlement, he saw that Scout made no move to go with him. The dog sniffed the air intently and uttered a deep growl. "Come on, Scout, let's go, boy," said Tom, taking the lead. Reluctantly, his dog followed him. A few meters farther, the woods thinned out, and Tom could travel much faster. But Scout was still holding back, looking behind him and baring his teeth at some invisible enemy. Tom was growing angry with the dog. Why did he choose to act so strange just when everything counted on speed? He was just about to scold him when the branches crackled and a huge dog burst out of the bushes. It was Lupus, and there was murder in his bloodshot eyes as he rushed at Tom. Before he reached Tom, however, Scout hurled himself on his old enemy with astonishing speed. The dogs rolled over on the ground in a twisting, snarling knot. Frightened, Tom watched the furious struggle. He wanted to help, but he didn't know how. He was afraid to step between the two dogs. Besides, they darted in and out so swiftly, their movements were a blur. Scout, however, once again proved that he was more agile than the big yellow dog. As Tom stood by uncertainly, waiting for the end of the fight, he again heard the branches crackling nearby. His pursuers were coming. They were almost here. "Here, Scout! Come, boy!" he called insistently. But Scout was fighting for his life, and this time he paid no attention to Tom. Tom could wait no longer. Another minute, and he'd be too late. Snatching up the suitcase once more, he ran on into the woods. He chose a path so that he was quickly hidden by the foliage. He was not a moment too soon. As he ran, he heard Louis screaming, "Shoot that mutt in the head! He's killing Lupus!" Tom was seized with horror, but he knew that he couldn't help his companion. Panting and perspiring, he stumbled on. He was almost winded, and his legs were giving out. Then, behind him, a shot rang out, immediately followed by a howl of pain from an animal. Tom felt as if the shot had struck him. A red haze appeared before his eyes. He stumbled over a dead branch and crashed to the ground. Another branch scratched his face, but he didn't feel it. Sobbing, he lay on the ground without moving. For a while, Tom didn't try to get up. He lay motionless, giving free rein to his tears. His faithful friend had been killed, and everything else seemed unimportant. Slowly, he pulled his thoughts together, and he knew that he was also in danger. Perhaps they'd try to kill him too. He pushed himself to his knees, weak with exhaustion. His strength was further sapped by the thought that flight was useless, for he didn't know his way in these woods, and his enemies seemed to be at home here. He was too tired to go on. Before him lay the suitcase that had brought him such grief. Maybe if he left it here on the path, they would stop chasing him. But no, he didn't want to do that. His old fighting spirit began to return. Was there nothing he could do to escape? He cast about for an idea. About 10 meters ahead of him was a bunch of dense bushes clustered around a large dead tree. If he hid in those bushes, maybe his pursuers wouldn't see him. It was a slim chance, but he had to try it. It was all he could think of. Again, he picked up the suitcase and hurried toward the bushes. With his last strength, he squeezed through the mass of branches until he reached the large trunk. Then he made a discovery that sent a shock of hope through him. The tree was hollow, and in the bottom of the trunk was a hole large enough for him to crawl into. Now he had a chance. Carefully, he broke off a few leafy branches. Then he crawled into the hollow trunk and planted the branches in front of the opening so that it was completely hidden. Sitting down on the suitcase, he tried to collect himself after all the emotional and physical stress of the last few hours. Slowly his mind grew calmer and clearer. He felt quite safe in this well-hidden spot. The desperate fear that had overcome him had faded, but he was broken-hearted at the death of his faithful dog. Or had Scout perhaps only been wounded? No, he had clearly heard Louis shout, "Shoot that mutt in the head!" And he was sure that the horrible cry he had heard had been a death cry. He thought again of his friends on the sailboat. They must be worried about him. How long had he been away? He had lost all track of time. He was supposed to be getting help to pull the boat off the island, and instead he had gotten himself into an awful mess. He froze as he heard the rustling of leaves. Someone was quietly creeping through the woods. Tom's heart almost stopped. Had the gang found his trail? Perhaps Lupus had followed him? Someone was searching the bushes, and Tom shrank back from the opening as far as he could, hardly daring to breathe. Suddenly a form pushed through the branches. Tom had propped up in front of the opening, and a dog slipped inside. It was Scout. Overjoyed to see him, Tom threw his arms around the dog's neck. Scout was no less happy to see his master and licked his face and hands. Tom could hardly believe that he was holding his dog in his arms. He ran his hand over the dog looking for a wound, but he found nothing. What about the gunshot he had heard and the cry? There was only one explanation. The poacher must have missed Scout and killed Lupus. Scout, who knew all too well what a gunshot meant, must have gotten away before the man could shoot again. Tom hugged his dog again. Now that Scout was back, he began to believe that he might get out of there after all. Even as he sat there, however, Tom heard the sound of voices. They were not very close, but he could tell that they were coming closer. Scout heard them too, and growled softly. Tom pressed him down and whispered a quiet command in his ear. Their only chance lay in keeping as quiet as possible. Meanwhile, Tom listened to hear what the men were saying. At first he couldn't make out any words, but then he picked out the voices of Louis and the poacher. They seemed to be quarreling. Louis spoke in a shrill voice, accusing the poacher of shooting Lupus. Suddenly, the poacher became fed up. With a flood of curses, he bellowed at Louis to stop his whining, or else he'd give him a hide full of buckshot, just like his dog. That seemed to keep Louis quiet. Now Tom suddenly heard Jimmy's voice. In a taunting voice, he said, "I thought you were a better shot than that, Jace. How you ever managed to miss that dog, I'll never know." "It's easy for you to talk," the poacher came back. "They were rolling around so fierce I could hardly tell one dog from the other. When I pulled the trigger, that German shepherd took off like a shot. But I've got one shell that I'm saving for him, and I promise you, I'll get him too." The voices were very close now. Tom felt extremely uneasy, and Scout was trembling with fury, but he obeyed Tom and remained still. The voices stopped for a few moments. Then Tom heard Jay say, "I've had no trouble following his trail to here. Look, there's a footprint in that moss over there, and this twig was broken not too long ago. He's been heading in a straight line, but now I've lost it. Let's take a good look around this area." Tom's heart leaped into his throat. He hadn't thought they'd be able to follow his tracks through the woods, but Jay seemed to be a skilled tracker. It didn't look good for him and Scout. As Tom listened, the poacher gave the others some instructions, but he spoke quietly so that Tom could not hear what he said. He got the impression that the gang was spreading out to look for him. If they found him, he was sure they'd kill him and Scout. He folded his hands and quietly prayed. The bushes crackled, and someone pushed his way through. He came to the huge trunk and stopped. Seconds went by, while whoever it was stood in front of the opening, blocking the little light that had been filtering in. If he looked closely at the branches planted in front of the opening, he'd probably see the hole behind them. Tom held Scout tightly. The dog was coiled to attack, but Tom restrained him. Although he quivered, Scout remained quiet. Tom heard someone mutter, "Where could that kid have gone?" And whoever it was crashed through the bushes, going away from the tree. A few seconds later, he whistled to the rest of the gang. Now Tom could hear the gang arguing. They were determined to catch him because he had stolen the suitcase with the loot and because they blamed him for Lupus's death. Tom shuddered as he heard them threaten what they would do to him when they caught him, but he consoled himself with the thought that they would have to find him first. After a few moments, the poacher took charge. "That kid is gone for now, but I know a way to catch him. I'm sure he's headed back to that sailboat, but he don't know these woods, so we'll get to the lake before he does. We'll take the rowboat out and jump those two other kids on the sailboat. Then we'll wait until our little friend returns with the suitcase." "And what are we going to do with the whole bunch?" asked Jimmy. The poacher didn't answer right away. Then he replied very slowly, "We'll see. That lake is pretty deep. They wouldn't be the first to drown in it while swimming." The voices moved away as Jason and his helpers hurried off to carry out their plan. Tom didn't move until it was quiet for a while. Fear clutched at his stomach. Now his friends were also in danger. He had to stop Jason and his gang. But how? All he could think of was to follow them with Scout. Perhaps he could get a chance to warn Carl and Bert. He decided to leave the heavy suitcase in the hollow tree. If he could memorize the surroundings, he would be able to find the place later.